They said the railroad would save Florida, that it would pull this land out of silence and into the future. But no one asked what the land would lose. I remember the day the iron first screamed through the pines. The ground trembled. Children stopped running. Men took off their hats, not in pride, but in fear. That road didn't just carry goods, it carried power, it carried division. And long before the war ever came, Florida was already being torn apart, 1 mile of steel at a time.
I still remember the first time I heard that sound, a deep metallic groan echoing through the pine forest as if the earth itself was shifting. We didn't know what it was then, only that the stillness had been broken. For years, Florida had been a place at distance, miles of untouched land where the air smelled of resin and wild orange, and travel meant weeks by horse or boat. They said the railroad would change all that. The talk began in taverns and meeting halls, with men in fine coats leaning over maps, arguing about routes. They spoke of connection, prosperity, of dragging Florida into the modern world. Iron roads, one of them said. That'll make this land breathe again. The farmers nodded, though most of them barely understood what a locomotive looked like. But not everyone was invited to those tables. Down near the Swanee, I saw the other side of that dream, the men who would build it. They were brought from plantations by the dozens, chained in groups, their backs bare in the sun. Every swing of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat. I was a boy then, sent to bring water to the workers. I remember how they looked at the ground as they worked, not because they were afraid to look up, but because hope had become something that belonged to other people. The overseer barked at him from horseback, his words sharp as the crack of his whip. "Faster, boys, the future don't wait." One of the older men beside me, a thin, quiet man with scars along his arms, whispered, "Ain't our future he's talking about." Then he went back to hammering. Weeks passed, then months. Iron rails stretched mile by mile through the forest, slicing through swamps where the air smelled of rot and water lilies. The men sang sometimes, low songs, half prayer and half defiance. When the wind carried those voices through the pines, it felt like the land was humming with pain. By the winter of '59, the first section was done. Folks from miles around came to see the miracle. The whole town gathered near the track, women in white bonnets, children clutching their fathers' legs, merchants holding hats against the smoke. When the engine appeared, black and enormous, it was as if some monster had come to life from a story. Steam poured from its sides, the whistle screamed, horses reared and bolted. People cheered anyway. "She's beautiful," someone shouted. "Beautiful and worth every drop of sweat that built her." But I looked toward the edge of the crowd, where the men who had laid the track stood apart, quiet, watching the train pass. The smoke rose and wrapped around their faces. They didn't cheer. They just stared, eyes glinting through the haze as the train rolled toward the horizon, carrying white men's dreams and leaving their labor behind in the dust. That night, after the crowd had gone and the forest was still again, I walked down to the tracks. The metal was still warm to the touch. The moonlight gleamed off it like a scar across the land. In the distance, I could hear frogs calling in the swamp and a faint rumble, maybe another train or thunder. I remember thinking how strange it was, this road of iron cutting through a place that had always belonged to silence. It felt like something holy and dangerous at once, like we had built a promise the land itself did not agree to keep. And even then, though I couldn't have said why, I knew that what they called progress would not save us. It would only make the distance between people longer, even as the miles between them grew shorter.
The trains didn't stop once they came. Every week the whistles grew louder, the engines heavier, the people more certain that Florida was being born anew. They said the state was finally awake, that commerce would run faster than the rivers, that every man could find his fortune if only he worked hard enough. But that wasn't true for everyone. In the towns that grew along the line, the planters grew richer. Cotton, sugar, and turpentine now moved faster than men could count. Slaves were bought in larger numbers to keep up with the trade, and their chains clinked louder than any train's whistle. The railroad had turned sweat into gold, and gold into blindness. I remember one summer afternoon at the depot in Madison. The platform was crowded, merchants shouting over crates, the smell of tobacco and sweat thick in the air. A man in a fine hat stood watching the trains being loaded, his thumb hooked in his vest pocket. "This here," he said proudly, "is what makes us equal to Georgia and Carolina. Industry, gentlemen, that's our salvation." A poor farmer nearby, clothes frayed, shoes full of dust, spat into the dirt. Equal maybe, but not to each other. The man in the hat didn't hear him. Or maybe he pretended not to. I saw more of those faces as the months passed, the ones left behind, small farmers who couldn't afford freight costs, craftsmen whose wagons were replaced by trains, freedmen who found no work on the line except in chains. The railroad didn't carry everyone forward. It carried some straight into ruin. Yet there was something deeper beneath it all, a quiet unease that hung in the air. The talk in taverns began to shift, less about progress, more about the North, about tariffs, about the future of slavery. Newspapers filled with sharp words and prouder ones still. States' rights, they called it, Southern destiny. But even the loudest voices trembled when they spoke of it, as though they could sense what was coming. I remember a night in a boarding house outside Tallahassee. The air was thick with cigar smoke and heat. A young merchant from Jacksonville sat across from an older farmer, arguing over rum. "Don't you see?" said the merchant. "The iron will keep us free. The North can't touch us now. We trade through our own ports, our own lines." The farmer shook his head slowly. "Free?" he said. "You don't build freedom on other men's backs. You build it on a grave." The room fell quiet. Outside, a train passed, its whistle long and mournful like it was answering him. The more the rails stretched, the more divided Florida became. The towns near the ports gleamed with new hotels, brick warehouses, gas lamps. But inland, the soil grew poorer and the temper shorter. The same rails that carried cotton and wealth also carried envy, rumor, and fear. And through it all, the enslaved kept building. They were moved from plantation to construction camps, from sawmills to depots, their hands never idle. Each hammer strike was another link in a chain that bound the state tighter to the Confederacy that was coming. One evening near Lake City, I saw a group of them resting by the tracks as the sun fell behind the trees. Their faces were gray with dust. One of them, an older man with hair gone white, looked at the rails glinting in the dying light. "It's a funny thing," he said softly.
They say this road gonna bring the South together, but it's cut through everything we got left." Nobody answered. They just sat there listening to the metal cooling in the twilight. That night, I walked home with the sound of the rails in my ears, that faint humming note the iron makes after the train is passed. It sounded almost like breath, like something alive waiting. And for the first time, I realized the truth. The railroad had not united Florida. It had only drawn the first hard line through its heart.
By the spring of '61, the whistle of the trains had changed. It was sharper now, urgent, nervous, full of something the land didn't understand. The talk of progress was gone. Men spoke of loyalty, honor, and war. The same tracks that once carried crops now carried soldiers. The same hands that had built the railroads now dug trenches beside them. I remember the morning the first regiment left. The station was thick with steam and dust. Mothers clung to sons in gray coats. Wives waved handkerchiefs until the train curved out of sight. Someone played a fiddle, badly, and a few men shouted, "For the South," as if the sound itself could make them breathe. But there was no glory in it, not really. Only noise and fear, the smell of smoke that lingered long after the trains had gone. Those rails that had once promised life began to carry death. Cannons, powder, wounded man. News of defeats traveled faster now, and the weight of war reached even the smallest settlements. I heard old Mrs. Lang from Monticello say, "The iron's cursed. It's bringing sorrow quicker than the Lord ever meant it to." She wasn't wrong. The war came like a fever, slow at first, then consuming everything. Towns along the line emptied, fields went untended. The ports were blockaded, the trains ran on borrowed coal, and men who'd once bragged of progress now cursed the very machines they'd built. At night, the forests burned, not from industry, but from raids and retreat. The railroad was a corridor of ghosts. I saw the worst of it one summer near Baldwin. A train had derailed after Union troops destroyed the bridge ahead. The cars lay twisted in the swamp, half sunk in mud. Smoke drifted between the cypress trees. A boy no older than 16 sat by the wreck, his arm bound in rags. He was staring at the tracks. "They said the railroad would save the South," he murmured, not looking up. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that fit anymore. By '64, even the trains had begun to starve. There was no fuel, no metal, no man left to mend the rails. Horses pulled wagons where engines once roared. The same depots that had overflowed with trade were now shelters for refugees. The grand promise of progress had turned to ash. And yet, amidst the ruin, something unexpected began to move along those same tracks. At night, when the soldiers slept, small groups of enslaved men and women followed the rail lines northward, guided by moonlight and memory. The road that had once carried their bondage now became their passage to freedom. I remember one night, late near the Withlacoochee, I saw them moving silently between the trees, a family of 5. The mother carried a child, her feet bare and bleeding. The father paused at the track, his face lit by a faint orange glow from the horizon. He pressed his hand against the rail, as if feeling for a heartbeat. "Funny," he whispered. "This iron used to belong to them. Tonight, it belongs to us." Then they disappeared into the dark. When the war finally ended, Florida was not the same. The railroads lay broken in places, their bridges gone, their stations hollow.
But they would rise again, rebuilt, expanded, modernized. New investors would come, new money, new names. People would speak once more of progress, and few would remember the cost. I sometimes walk along the old lines now, where the forest has grown back around them. The rails are rusted, half buried under moss and pine needles. But if you stand there long enough, you can still feel the faint hum beneath your feet, like the land remembering what it endured. The railroad built Florida, they say. Maybe that's true, but it also split her soul. And it did so with such quiet certainty that most never even heard the sound of it breaking.